Good afternoon. Thank you for joining Family Caregiver Alliance for values-based decision-making in caregiving situations, tools for improving family dynamics. I'm Calvin Hu, Education Coordinator at FCA and your host. For nearly 4 decades, FCA has been working across the Bay Area and through the nation to improve the well-being of family caregivers. We offer support through consultations, classes, workshops, publications, retreats, research, and advocacy. If you'd like to learn more about us, you can access us at www.caregiver.org. Now for some quick housekeeping. During the webinar, your phones or mics are going to be muted, so if you have any questions, you can ask them by going to the chat style box on the bottom of your screen. We'll answer as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar. We'll also be asking you to give some feedback after the webinar ends, and we use this to help shape future education programs. So I'd like to thank you all in advance for filling those out, as we do read all your comments. So today I'd like to welcome Professor Mary McCall. Mary is from Oakland, California. She earned her doctorate in human development and aging from the University of California, San Francisco. She was professor of psychology for over 25 years at St. Mary's College and is faculty at Fielding Graduate University. She's currently a visiting professor in social and health sciences at Jönköping University in Jönköping, Sweden, and she is coordinator of faculty development at Samuel Merritt University. Her work is focused on services for low-income elders, the role of cultural values in social policies for older persons in different countries, and of course, how values impact family decision-making in caregiving situations. So now that you know a little bit more about our guest, I'd like to turn things over to Mary.
Okay, thanks, Calvin, for that nice introduction about the Family Caregiver Alliance and its great resources, and some about my background. I'd like to welcome all the listeners and thank you for being here. I hope that what I have to offer today is of some help to you in some way or at some point. I want to let you know that I'm happy to talk with anyone or correspond by email, which was on the first slide and is going to be on the last slide of the presentation as well, if you want to talk about any specific situations or other questions about the content that I give you at a later point. So the overall flow of my presentation is going to be as follows. I'll start with a definition of values, give a bit about my own family interactions about values in caregiving situations, since sadly we've had much caregiving to do in my family, and how they can also sometimes be a barrier to cooperative decision making. Then I'll introduce the Hall-Tonna values map that I often use in working with individuals and families, not just about caregiving situations, but really about any life situation that someone is facing. For the purposes of this webinar, I'll be talking about specifically the situation of family caregiving, however family is defined by someone, or anyone that you might be supporting in late life, or in earlier life as well. Then I'll talk specifically about how values get played out in families around caregiving, and also how differing values between people can create barriers to clear and cooperative decision making. I'll give some examples of how values can be considered and inquired about to get insight into how people are viewing caregiving from their perspective, and how they're viewing the decisions that they face, which hopefully then can lead to at least better understanding and hopefully better communication between people. I'll also talk a bit about how to reflect on your own values and how that can help not just in caregiving, but again, really in any life situation. And then I'll give some examples of how to engage in discussions with others about their values, and a couple specific examples from people that I've worked with. And then we'll wrap up with any questions or comments that you'd like to make. Okay? Next slide. So Brian P. Hall, who developed this values map, defined values as the ideals that give significance to our lives, that are reflected through the priorities we choose, and that we act on, even if not consciously. Okay? Why do people's values differ? I think we can probably all guess about this, that our worldviews can differ. And our worldviews come from our life experiences, which are influenced by our family, our friends, our society, our culture. Living here in Sweden now for about 3 months, I've gained a lot of insight into their cultural values, and specifically around aging and support services for families and older people. So it's been a really interesting experience for me to be here and see that. And things like gender identity or expression, physical ability, race or ethnicity or national origin, social class, religion, spirituality, sexual identity, all of these things help shape our values, even if we're not necessarily aware of that all the time. Okay? Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my own family constellation and how values have played out in my family. I have 12 brothers and sisters and 2 parents, so there's 15 people. And sadly, we've lost 3 of my brothers and my father to cancer. And this has been mostly in the last 4 years. So we've had lots of experience dealing with caregiving situations and caregiving decisions about these different situations. I've certainly seen conflicting values at play, sometimes just within myself, what's most important to me right now. And certainly between myself and some of my siblings, and myself and my mother, particularly around taking care of my father. And my parents actually had some value differences as well about the kind of care that they wanted in their late life. And actually, my father ended up coming and living with us for much of the last year of his life because my mother just couldn't handle dealing with him anymore and didn't want to make decisions about his care anymore. He had dementia as well as bone cancer, so it was a very challenging caregiving situation for her, which I can totally understand. But because of all of these different values at play, it did result in some episodes of poor communication and value judgments about others. Why do you think that's more important than this? Which broke down at times our capacity to support each other in what we all really wanted to do, which was to provide the best care we could for my father, my mother, and my brothers. Okay? So sometimes there are barriers to understanding and working with each other in families. And here we're going to talk about values. So a lot of us, we're not really taught to think about or evaluate what are our values. We mostly take them for granted, or often they're unconscious until they come into question. And in caregiving situations, they often come into question. And so many of us have a lack of personal insight about our values. And some of us might also have either a lack of willingness or inability to share with others about what values are underlying the decisions that we think ought to be made. I've often seen in families where money is an underlying value, but people don't want to say, hey, I want that money for my inheritance. I don't want it to be spent on what I think is, more expensive care than someone necessarily needs, that I think they need. So that those kinds of things are often hard to say when maybe what we think is most important, we know other people aren't going to agree about if we actually said, what I'm concerned about is my future inheritance. We also often see reemergence of old family conflicts between the child and the parent, between siblings, extended family, etc. So sometimes people who have not had a positive or close relationship with their parent now have to take care of them. And that's a lot of conflicting feelings that people have to deal with. And sibling issues, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, often come up. And I think that people need to process those feelings and things that have happened in the past in order to face the present challenges in as present and clear a way as we can. But I don't usually advocate that you process with that person in the situation. I often recommend that you process your feelings with somebody else who's actually not involved in the caregiving situation, unless you feel like there's an opportunity to resolve some things with other family members, which will improve communication and understanding and caregiving overall. Okay? So we'll talk about the Hall-Tonna map of human development and values. This was developed by Brian P. Hall and Benjamin Tonna. It's based on multiple models of human development, like Abraham Maslow's and Erik Erikson's ideas of human development, and different measures of values, for example, Martin Rokeach's. It assumes a potential for gradual movement from concerns about self to concerns about others to concerns about the world at large. So they developed an inventory that both individuals and groups can use to assess their current as well as their aspirational values. Okay, next slide. So they organize this map through these different 4 phases that range from a worldview of I need to survive because the world is a mystery over which I have no control, to a sense of belonging where I see the world as a problem with which I must cope and figure out how to fit in, to a phase of self-initiating worldview where we see the world as a creative project in which we want to participate and add our own unique part to it, to a phase of a worldview of interdependence, where we see the world as a mystery, but we also see the world as something that we need to care for on a global scale. Okay? Excuse me. So Hall and Tonna talked about values as either being goal values or means values. Goal values are about how we want to be in the world, such as I want to be able to experience sensory delight. I want to be able to balance intimacy and solitude in my life. And then they talked about means values, which are the ways in which are the skills we need to achieve our goal values, such as I want to have physical affection in my life because that's going to be able to help me experience sensory delight. Or I need to figure out how to build in time for solitude in my life so that I can have a balance between intimacy with other people and solitude for myself. Okay, next slide. So here's the values map. I know it's difficult to see, and the goal is to not read every word on here, and I'm happy there's a reference to the book that introduces this by Brian Hall on the last slide. It's called Values Shift. But the items here, at the top you can see the different phases of surviving, belonging, self-initiating, and interdependence. Sorry. And then within each of those 2 substages, and then below that are the goal values, and below that are the means values. And then down at the bottom is kind of where you get placed depending on your responses to the items on the inventory. And then we use this tool as a basis for discussion of what are the values that are being enacted in your life right now. And sometimes we're not living the values that we would like to be able to live for a variety of circumstances. Maybe I need to keep my job that is not fulfilling or meaningful to me because I have to take care of my parent or my partner or my children. Okay, next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about each stage to see how these issues and values arise in caregiving situations. So in the first stage, for people who are really focused on maintaining a sense of security, if we're focused on safety, then what Hall and Tonna are saying is that one of our values is going to be self-preservation. I want to focus on how am I going to take care of myself. And for those of us who are in caregiving situations, that's actually a really good question. How do we take care of ourselves as caregivers? On the other hand, if we're fearful of the world, it may be hard to go out and find the resources in a proactive way that we need to provide appropriate care for our family members. And sometimes, basically, we have to ask the question about how we provide food and shelter. Do I have to have my parent come and live with me because we don't have the economic resources for them to get care elsewhere? And what economic impact might that have on me? And warmth, is that physical warmth as well as emotional warmth are important for a sense of security. And then in the second substage of security, we can think about physical security. And that's really important in a caregiving situation where you're talking about, is my family member going to be physically secure and safe? And we're often also faced, given our poor social policy around supporting people who need care, that a lot of families face economic security, and we have to make economic choices about what we can afford and where that might have to happen in our home or elsewhere. We also might be somebody who really needs a lot of predictability. And as I'm sure we all know, caregiving is not a predictable situation to be in. And so some people get really fearful about caregiving because it is really unpredictable. The idea of spatial security is, am I going to have space so when my father moved in with us, I had to think about where's the space where I can kind of have some space to myself and time to get away from caregiving even though we were in the same space together. Okay? In the second stage of belonging, look at family. To feel like we belong to our family, we need to be recognized for who we are and accepted for who we are. But some families also say the way that you belong is by fulfilling your duty and obligation to each other. And family is really often where we develop our first sense of self-worth, whether for good or for bad. But we need self-worth to be able to develop further in a healthy way. And we know from a lot of developmental research that children need some degree of control and order in their lives. And that can be positive, but that can also be overwhelming. And for people who feel like the way I take care of my family is to control things, can be really challenging for other people if they're feeling over-controlled, as well as overstressing that person. In terms of belonging to an institution or an organization, Hall and Tonna talk about developing a sense of competence and confidence, and that's important as well. Do we feel competent and confident as a caregiver? Do we feel like we can handle the job? Some of that sometimes comes from competition versus collaboration. And so I often see this in families between siblings, that they're going to compete for who's the best child, right? Who's taking the best care of mom or dad, as opposed to developing a sense of belonging through collaboration. And we also get our worth and value sometimes from the work that we do and our sense of success or failure. So if our sense of belonging is based on what we do, then sometimes in caregiving situations, there are some of us who really focus on the tasks at hand rather than the person and the relationship. Okay, next slide. In the third stage of self-initiating, in terms of vocation, Hall-Tonna talk about finding the work that's meaningful for you and being able to be adaptable as things unfold in your life and responsible as well in the work that you do. And to develop a sense of integration and wholeness, that how I am in the world is reflected in the work that I'm doing as well. And then a sense of equality and liberation, that part of what is important to me is that people feel like they're being treated equally and are free to be themselves so that they can also manifest self-actualization and become more of themselves, which then we see in the next stage of the order where people are able to be themselves and be treated with human dignity. And that if I'm being my full, authentic self, I can be present in a situation and present with someone as my full self. And so we can see how some of these things are going to be challenging in a caregiving situation if I feel like I can't be myself with my parent or with my siblings. If there's parts of myself that were never accepted or recognized. And yet here I am in a caregiving situation where I feel like I'm not really able to be myself. And either I'm not being treated with dignity or I'm unable to treat other people with dignity. And sometimes because of that, we have a really hard time just being present with someone. And sometimes that's what someone needs, right? It's just for us to be there with them in that moment, hold their hand, stroke their arm, or just be silent, but be present. And that's hard to do if we're fighting ourselves or feel like we're fighting other people who are in the caregiving situation. Next slide. In the fourth stage of interdependence, they talk about wisdom as one of the sub-stages. And this is where we really develop a sense of connection with each other, and we're able to balance both our internal different parts of ourselves, for example, the need for intimacy as well as solitude, really being able to see what's the truth of the situation, what are the needs, the most important needs that are being called to be fulfilled right now, how can we work synergistically with people and interdependently with others in a positive and healthy way in order to take the best care of this person as we can. And then at the other substage here, the world order, they talk about having to focus on global harmony and justice. And when they talk about word, they're talking about being able to speak simply, clearly, concisely, and in a focused way about what is the issue at hand. And they talk about using technology, the use of technology, and this is a big issue too in caregiving. When you have to decide what kind of medical interventions or not are people going to use. And there are many families who disagree about how much and what kinds of technology should be used, particularly at the end of life. And to think about fundamental human rights. And so we may also argue within our families about who has the right to what. So what I like about this concept and map is that it gives us real words and concepts and ideas to talk about that we can see manifested in caregiving situations. Okay, next slide. So I encourage people to reflect on your values intentionally. What values do I want to live my life by? Am I able to do that right now? And if not, why? And how might I be able to move closer to that? What values would I be proud to see expressed in my family? What values am I proud to see exercised in my work role? And then what values come to bear in caregiving situations? Next slide. If we apply these ideas to decision-making in families, I believe that in bringing unconscious values, conscious awareness through this process of identification and articulation of values, that we can more clearly and intentionally make decisions that support and enact one's values or someone else's, like I said about my dad. Excuse me, getting over a cold. Since I was his power of attorney for healthcare, when I was making decisions, with my siblings, I had to keep saying, this is not about what we would want. This is about what Dad would want. Even in his dementia, where he wouldn't even understand, he didn't even remember that he had cancer. So he would not be able to participate in decisions about what kind of medical interventions or treatments he should have for his cancer. And it doesn't mean that different values are not going to be at play or in seeming conflict. Of course, that is going to happen. But I think that knowing that and being able to talk about that as openly as possible, we can make a better informed and a value-based decision. Okay? So, for our own reflections on our values, I find that it becomes easier to begin to identify the values of others. We can also check out our sense of what other values are at play in decision-making situations by asking questions or having discussions, or sometimes just by sharing our own values about a given situation. And this can open up clearer communication in a non-threatening way by asking things such as, can you help me understand what's at stake here for you? I'm curious about what you feel is most important right now. Do you think that A is more important than B right now? Or what do you think Mom or Dad or our sibling would say is most important right now? Okay, next slide. So I'm going to give you a couple case situations that I've worked with. So one is an example of a man who has a wife with dementia who he had been taking care of in their home, and he himself is getting older and has physical challenges, and he cannot care for her anymore in their home, even though she continually says to him, promise me you won't leave me. So we got to think about what are the values that might be in play here for her and for him, and then how would you advise this man? Okay, next slide. So I saw this as if his wife's most important value to her is his presence and the sense of safety and security that that brought her, but that really, realistically, it was not possible for that to happen in their own home anymore, then it was really helpful for him to consider how he could assure her that he wasn't leaving her emotionally or spiritually, even though they weren't in the same physical space anymore. And he could work with the staff about how to consistently provide contact, support, reminders, pictures, cards, family things that she would recognize to remind her that he was close by. And then this also enabled him then to take care of himself so that he could, in fact, be more fully present with her and not be exhausted himself by doing the physical care of her. Okay? Here's another case situation. An adult child promises his father that he'll take care of his mother for him after his father dies. Turns out he really is unable to care for her. She has very bad dementia and physical care needs. He can't really care for her appropriately in his house, but he feels that he can't, quote, put her anywhere because of his promise to his father. So again, think about what values are in play here and what you might say to him about how to make decisions here. Okay, next slide. If the most important value is his commitment to his father, his promise to care for his mother, his sense of duty or obligation, then he might need to consider that promise can be fulfilled in many different ways. And in fact, if he's not the best person to provide the best care for his mother, is having her moved to a high-quality care home that they can afford not fulfilling that promise? And also, is his own exhaustion and the stress on his marriage what his father would have wanted for him as the cost for fulfilling that promise? Okay, next slide. So oftentimes what we need to do is to reframe the values that people hold. I'm not saying change the values at all, but maybe we need to reframe the values in specific circumstances and what they might look like. Because oftentimes in caregiving, we can't predict what's going to happen. We don't know the decisions we're going to face. And so we can't always plan. And yet here we are faced with a situation where we have to think, this is important, but how is it going to actually be able to be lived out in this situation? So does leaving someone mean you have to keep them at your home? Or is leaving perhaps more spiritual and emotional rather than physical? And how can you be present with someone when you don't live with them? What does that person need to feel your presence, to feel safe and secure? And is a promise to take care of someone necessarily imply that you are the best person to provide the best care for that person? And if you really can't emotionally or physically handle that care, are you really fulfilling your promise? Okay, next slide. So you can see that there are going to be potential value conflicts, not even potential, but there are value conflicts often in caregiving situations. And what is the cost of a competing value? What if someone thinks it's best to have their family member somewhere else to get care, but they can't really afford what they would like? That's a real question for many, many people in the United States. What about the potential cost of my sense of belonging to my family in terms of other relationships? So am I willing to go along with something I don't believe in because I don't want to sever my relationships with other family members? Or what is the cost to my immediate family if I'm caring for someone in our home? Okay? So I always talk about the trouble with values, because values are not always clear or conscious. They're not always easily identifiable, and especially when they're in competition with each other. And there is seldom, I would say almost never, a perfect answer in any one caregiving situation. Someone is usually giving up something. And so I think the reality is that we have to help people or help ourselves to really reflect on what is it that we're doing and why, what is it we're not doing and why, and what does that mean? And are we willing to give up something because the other value is more important? So I think the goal is not to make the perfect decision. Sometimes it's clear that there is no right decision or no best situation to have someone in. But to be clear with yourself and with others about what values you're basing your decisions on. Okay? So dealing with family dynamics, I think, is how to bring to consciousness your own issues with both your parents or whoever's receiving care and or your siblings. Because there will be issues, and you're going to have to think about them, and I think the more consciously and intentionally you can really understand what's happening, you can deal with it in a healthier way. And then how do I process those? Again, as I said before, probably with someone else who's not in your family. unless it's an extended family member who's not involved in the caregiving situation. But sometimes that's dangerous too, if that person might be talking to your immediate family members about what you're sharing. And sometimes we just have to bracket those feelings and put them aside in order to deal with the tasks and decisions at hand. And I think we need to also understand our own limits, right? This is kind of number one rule in self-care for caregivers. We have to understand our own limits. And I think that we often don't think about understanding the limits of other family members. So not faulting siblings or other relatives for making the choices they're making at any given moment. They may not even be aware why they're making that decision. Maybe they can't face watching their parent decline and die. Maybe they have physical problems of their own, health issues that they have to deal with. Maybe they have a child with special needs that they have to take care of, and so they don't really have time and energy to participate in family caregiving in the way that I, as their sibling, might really want them to be doing. So I advocate, as much as possible, having a family meeting when a caregiving situation arrives, when you're out of, if there's a crisis that has to be dealt with immediately. But having a family meeting and talking about, okay, what are the issues that are on the table right now? What are the tasks that need to be done? What are the decisions that need to be made? And who can do what? So if someone lives out of state, maybe what they can do is call your parent once a week. Every Tuesday night, that's your assignment. Can you really do that? And I think this to really help in a family to say realistically, what can you really commit to? And not encouraging people to take on too much that then they're not going to be able to fulfill and you're going to be potentially resentful about. So really making it clear what we need is what people can really do. Because then that will help us understand what other kinds of resources or support we might need. I also always advocate using a tape recording at family meetings so that if someone isn't there, they can get a copy of what the discussion was. And if someone forgets, they have a copy of what the discussion was. And if things need to change, then they know what they said at the beginning and they know what they need to change. And I think that's important for everyone in the family to have, even if they're not involved in any particular way. Because sometimes, later on, siblings can say, well, I didn't know that was the situation. And so I believe it's important for every family member to be informed whether they're involved or not. Okay, next slide. So in terms of personal application, reflect on a decision that either you or someone you know is facing and having a difficult time with. Consider the elements and possible value conflicts that seem at play here. Try to identify what values you have or what values you know about the other person. And is there a way to open a conversation about values? Sometimes there are family members who are not willing to do this, and that's okay. And I think there's a lot of patience that we need with ourselves and with other people in caregiving situations. But for people who are interested and willing to participate in a conversation like this, I have found it to be really, really helpful. Okay, next slide. So if you can identify how some of these values might seem in conflict in contributing to the difficulty, I'm in conflict between value A and value B, and I really don't know how to decide, and so people feel or get paralyzed. Sometimes by articulating this and talking about it, we can identify what value or values is taking the highest priority and why. And to talk about what it means to prioritize values. It doesn't mean that the others aren't still important, but they may not be the primary values in action in this particular situation. Okay, next slide. So in conclusion, I want to say that I believe that through intentional reflection about values, that we can come to understand and articulate our own values better, and we can then begin to see how values are operating in others. Hopefully we can then engage in a dialogue about those values and respect each other, even without agreeing on them. Because I think the goal for me is that hopefully families can then engage in a more clear and focused decision-making process with their family members and others to provide the best care and make the best decisions that we can at any given moment. We can always look back and say, we shouldn't have made that choice. But all we can do at the time is be as informed as we can and make the best decision that we can at the time, because we're not going to be able to look back at that moment and see what it looked like a year, a week, a year, or 5 years from now. So, thank you for your time, and I'm open to any questions or comments that people might have.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Mary. As I mentioned in the intro, Mary is teaching at Jönköping University in Sweden. We're doing this completely remotely. She's not, visiting family in California. So I know we're all very happy to have her here today. It's actually her evening, our afternoon. But without further delay, I'd like to get into some questions. Actually, first, I had a question for you. It just kind of popped into my head about the family meeting. So, in terms of organizing a family meeting, kind of how would you recommend someone would go about scheduling that, or kind of logistics, or bringing that up? But also, in terms of once you've gotten everyone to agree to the family meeting, would it make sense to kind of try and go over kind of the different categories you mentioned, the different kinds of values, or is it enough for maybe someone to have that in the back of their head to help try and tease out what other people's values might be?
Well, first of all, I want to say if people want to start a family meeting or set up a family meeting, there are lots of resources online for that. I don't know if Family Caregiver Alliance has that information as well. So there's lots of ways to set it up. These days, it can be done, with mixed media. So when we did our family meeting around my father's care initially, several of us were in my house, and we had some people on the phone, and we had one brother on Skype. And so you can figure out how you're going to mix that, and time zones and all of that kind of thing. And I think a couple, sometimes either one or two people in the family might communicate with everybody and come up with, I'd like to suggest that we have a family meeting to talk about this. Here's why I think it's important. I would ask that everybody participate, even if it just means listening in, that there's no expectation that you have to say anything, but just so that you're informed as a member of the family about what's going on. And then I think it's also useful to have what is the situation at hand, a little summary, again, because maybe people who live out of state don't really know the details of what's going on. And talk about what are the tasks that need to be done, what are the decisions that need to be made, and then get into, okay, who can do this? And if you've reflected on your own values, then you might want to share those and say, I think at this point, one of the things at stake is this value. For me, this value is really important. Or for me, as Dad's representative, he's always said to me, this is really important to him. And So by starting laying out your own values, and you don't have to say values necessarily, you can just say what's most important at this point, and invite other family members to say, in your life right now, what's most important for you? What do you feel like you need to spend most of your time and energy on? So if someone is also dealing with health problems, that they could say, well, I really feel like I need to deal with my own health situation right now. Okay, that's useful for everybody to know so that we also feel connected, right? And then we're interdependent. Hey, maybe sometimes I need to help my brother as well as my father. So I think those kinds of elements of a family meeting can be helpful.
Okay. And again, how we went through kind of the Hall-Tonna model, the various phases and some of the values at play. Do you think that would be something for the whole, something like for someone trying to organize a family meeting to try and hand something like that out and maybe try and have that everyone have kind of that in front of their eyes, so while they're trying to come to decisions and trying to figure out what their values are? Or is it maybe something that just, again, maybe one person could just keep in the back of their head and try and maybe, if they're seeing maybe someone who's not speaking as much or maybe, is not being able to easily express their values, if it's something they could use to try and help that member out to express themselves?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you could. I think you would really want to understand what the terms are that they're using. And here on this slide we have the book by Brian, who I knew personally. It wrote the first book about the values shift, where he really goes through the model. It's not entirely academic, but there are certainly some academic terms in there. But I would be hesitant to pass out the map and then say, okay, let's talk about all these values.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But maybe more I would be more inclined to say, I read this book about values, and it was really helpful for me to learn what my own values are and how to articulate them. And so as I'm looking at the situation that we're facing as a family, I can say for myself, oh, here are the values for me, or the things that are equally important, and it's really hard for me to know what's the best decision here. And if anybody's interested in learning more about that, or looking at this book, or there's this map that we could look at together if people are interested and talk about it. But I would frame it in a very open, optional, non-academic way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And maybe not even talk about the book, but just list out some of the values that maybe you think are at play in your family,
Mm-hmm.
and talk about them. Say, I think we all know that money is a really important value right now, a really important thing we have to consider. How are we going to make decisions about what money is spent where and when and for whom? And so can we talk about that openly? And some people might say yes, and some people might say, I don't want to talk about money. Okay, you can listen.
Perfect, thank you. We actually do have a fact sheet on family dynamics. It's on our website if anyone's interested. It's at www.caregiver.org. I have actually a very good question, and you kind of alluded to it a little bit before. But if, say, they're trying to have a family meeting, and one of the person they're caring for has dementia, in addition to whatever other physical or impairments they might have. How would you play into trying to figure out what their values might be, or doing figuring out these the differing values and how care would work with someone with dementia?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, and that was something that, and of course I probably address this or approach this in a different way because I have a PhD in aging and I think about all these issues all the time. But I started really when my parents were in their late 70s and had a couple siblings come with me and just sit down over lunch and say, I'd like to have a conversation that I want to tape record, because then at that point my siblings were living all over the country, and say, what do you think you might want to do if you were in a bad accident? And, what at this point, what do you think your preferences might be? So that my siblings could actually hear my parents saying it, and not like, oh, that's what Mary said, they said. And I continued to do that about every 4 or 5 years, and tape record it and send it out so everybody had a copy. Because I knew of all the experiences I had had of people who end up in an emergency room and they've never had this conversation with their parents or with their siblings or other family members. And so how do you make decisions? Sometimes you can't, and so the decisions get left up to the physician to make, even though maybe after the crisis is over, you say, oh, I wouldn't have made that decision now that I have time to think about it. So I advocate having these discussions with families very early on and fairly regularly, even if that's every 4 or 5 years, but knowing I want to keep having these conversations so that I'm really sure that when my dad can no longer have these conversations, I know and I can see that he's been very consistent over the years about what's important to him. And I would, because of my own value, have these discussions with my father anyway in the moment, even though a minute later he wouldn't remember, because I just felt that was a way to respect him, to include him and inform him, even though he wouldn't necessarily remember it, because that's a value that's important to me.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah. And actually, I guess we have a little bit of a follow-up question to that one. In terms of maybe some of the more, maybe kind of the types of questions, or kind of the major kind of, the questions that people should be thinking to ask. Do you have any like recommendations on what some of these questions might be? I guess maybe like a do not resuscitate, or maybe like things, just kind of broad topics of what people should start, where they could start with these, kind of more difficult questions.
Right. I think the first question is, if you were in a bad accident, what do you think you would want us to do for you? And that goes right to the question of medical technology. And would you want to be on a heart-lung machine if that's what you needed to do? And that's if you look at the power of attorney for healthcare form or an advance directive, I think those are really good starting points. But I think technology is one, the use of technology, and some people will say, I want everything done for me. Okay, even if I as a child might not make that choice for myself or even for my parent, again, it's not my choice. Right, if I'm responsible for supporting my parents' values. Now, if they ended up in a coma, then I might be in a different situation where then I have to make decisions because that situation has changed. Maybe economically the situation has changed from 10 years ago when we had that conversation, or 5 years ago. Or that the family is really not capable of taking care of a parent in one of their homes. And even though that's what my mother said, I want to be in the home with one of my children and being taken care of, you never know what's going to happen in the family, and sometimes that's just not possible to have happen. So I think having the conversation about, family relationships, living situations, technology use, are good places to start, always recognizing that none of those are predictable. And most of the times it doesn't work out the way you think you want your late life to work out.
Thank you. We have kind of an interesting question here. I'm trying to wrap my head around it, but it's someone who you mentioned that all sorts of things come up in caregiving situations. But I guess what advice would you have for someone who has been in maybe an adult child who had a abusive parent, either controlling, verbally abusive or otherwise. I mean, in terms of getting into this caregiving role, getting into values, and kind of all these, all the various family dynamics that have been part of, at some level, of life. What kind of, I guess, recommendations would you give for this kind of very tricky situation?
Yeah, and it's also a very common situation, and there are actually some books written about the experiences of people who have been in that situation and how they have coped with it and what kinds of decisions they have made and why. And I think that's a perfect situation to really reflect on your values. Are you going to care for this parent because out of a sense of duty or obligation, or out of a sense of everybody deserves respect and human dignity, even though I didn't get that from them, that's my value, that I will provide that for them, right? I think that's a situation in which I was mentioning a couple times, really needing to process with someone, maybe a therapist or a counselor or professional, how am I going to deal with the feelings that are coming up? And at some point, do I make a different decision, right, that I'm not going to be involved? There are many people, right, who say, yeah, they abused me, I want nothing to do with them. But I think that also, if we're not clear about what we're doing and why, or what we're not doing and why we're not doing it, I think the clarity in that process also helps reduce what level of guilt someone might have after that person dies, right? Mm-hmm. And so you may say, maybe this is the way I can resolve. A lot of people find that caregiving situation actually is a way to resolve that relationship and heal that relationship. And some people say, I'm never in a position to feel like that relationship will be healed. And so there's no way I'm going to take care of that person. Mm-hmm. Right? And those are some of the people who end up in, Medicaid nursing homes because there's no one to take care of them. So I think trying to really understand what am I doing and why, or what am I not doing and why, can help someone make a clear decision. And when things get tough, to say, well, I want to quit, I'm really mad, or I'm really hurt, I'm really disappointed, but I know why I'm doing this. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to continue doing it.
Okay, fantastic. I think we have time for one last question. This is another great question. The listener is, kind of a hypothetical situation. If they're two siblings, they have opposing views on a critical care issue for their dying mother. She understands there can be, a difference of values and opinions, but, how would you actually be able to come to a concrete decision on this? I know you mentioned that it's usually not a perfect decision, there's maybe not a right decision, but how would two opposing, two people with two differing values on a certain issue figure out, come to some kind of consensus?
Excuse me. Again, if possible, the two people could have a conversation about what are they looking for, what's most important. And then perhaps in that situation where there's just two siblings and there's conflict, I would probably recommend asking somebody, maybe the hospital social worker or the physician or a nurse, to sit in and kind of facilitate a conversation to at least help each other understand each other better, because there is going to be a point where a decision has to be made. And again, someone might say after a discussion, okay, I'll go with that. It's not the decision I would make. Sometimes they need more information, right, about medical information that they need from someone else. But if you're really at a crossroads and really in conflict, and that means that no decisions are being made, when some decisions need to be made, right? Either medical staff will make a decision or nursing home staff will make a decision in a given moment because the family is not clear. Mm-hmm. And so I think we should be proactive and ask for help around that. Okay. And sometimes you have to give in for the sake of the parent being, receiving some kind of care, even if it's not the ideal that you would want for them. Mm-hmm. But those are tough situations, for sure.
Yeah, perfect. I think that's all the time we have now for questions. Of course, we are very happy that Mary was with us today. If caregivers have, or if anyone has questions for you, would they be able to best reach you at your Samuel Merritt email address?
Yes. Yeah.
Perfect. So it's mmccall@samuelmerritt.edu. If you have any additional questions, you can also contact Family Caregiver Alliance ed programs at caregiver.org. Part of our survey, there will be parts for comments. You can also ask your questions there. So again, I'd like to thank you all for participating today with our webinar presented by Professor Mary McCall. Thanks again, Mary.
My pleasure.
So, our FCA webinars are free. They are bi-monthly. If you'd like to know more about what we have, what's coming up, you can always visit us at www.caregiver.org. So thanks again, Mary, for joining us today. The webinar is now concluded, and we hope to see you all next webinar. Have a great afternoon.
Okay. Have a great day, everyone.